Your stuff is over there on the left. Mom gestured vaguely towards the back of the storage room, and I scanned the stack of brown cardboard boxes. On each, my father's handwriting spelled out, "Kids' rooms," in unhelpful black Sharpie. You're going to have to be more specific, Mama. I chuckled a bit, when my boy's voice had betrayed some frustration at a long day spent moving furniture. Before I'd even finished the sentence, she stalked over to my corner of the storage room with the wordless sense of urgency that, despite nearly a decade of living on my own, I still associated with impending doom. Still silent, she cut through the tape on the box just to my left. Then, head shaken and eyebrows raised, Mum returned to her own stack of boxes and kept unpacking. I waited until she was safely across the room to start looking through my belongings. I stared at the box, hand on my hips, as I examined its contents. What should I do with the stuff I want to keep? Just leave it in the box, Dan. That way you won't have to repack everything when you get back to New York. I started to explain that my postage stamp of an apartment barely had enough room for whatever possessions my bartender's budget provided, let alone childhood keepsakes. But as if anticipating the response, Mom cut me off. Your father and I don't have the space to keep everything here. I looked pointedly around the cavernous storage room and swallowed another retort. Childhood relics practically burst from the box in front of me, and I rifled past all composition books, dented sports trophies, grass street jerseys, a banged up old laptop, and even a questionably stained Santa hat. Some brought fond memories, others brought cringe. All went straight back into a plastic trash bag at my feet. Graded assignments filled the next box. At first, bright red A's adorned the wrinkled papers, but the box must have been organized chronologically, because the grades soon became B's, and then before long, C's and D's. These too went in the bag. It wasn't until I worked through 6 more boxes, and with them nearly a half hour of nostalgia, that I stumbled across something I wanted to keep. A photo album. It was small, just wide enough that a standard 4x6 picture, that kind of used to be developed from a roll of film, could fit on one page. The outside was bound in cushiony green faux leather, with little metal bits binding the edges. It was made to look fancy, but surely cost no more than a few dollars. The sort of thing one might buy at a small kiosk. I flipped it open. A blonde-haired kid with bright blue eyes stood back at me. He was dressed in green linen robe and holding what looked to be like a plastic shepherd's cane. I sputtered and looked up to show my mother, but at some point while I'd been lost in the boxes, she'd gone inside. I looked back down to the photo, and the memories of the long-forgotten school play came rushing back. Smiling, I turned the page. The next picture showed a little blonde me next to a nearly identical boy with his arm around my shoulder. The 2 kids in the photo had the same blue eyes, the same crooked smile, and the same dimpled cheeks. Only one feature was different. The young version of me had a Macaulay Culkin-like bowl cut of white blonde hair so bright that I can remember the adults asking if I bleached it. The other child, Matt, had the same bowl cut, but his was unremarkable, almost colorless shade of sandy brown. My grin faded, and I rubbed a hand over my chest, just above my heart. Then, hoping to find more memories just like the first one, I flipped the page. Thankfully, the next picture showed me the little blonde version of me chasing after a soccer ball. The one after that showed me roller skating, hand in hand with the girl the same age, and the album went on like that, with each page after page of idyllic scenes from happy childhood. I couldn't remember leaving out each one of them, but most brought at least a fond feeling, and my wide grin returned as I leafed through the photos. That is, until I reached the end. The final picture in the album seemed at first to be just like the rest. In it, I sat amongst other kids, all making silly faces and looking generally happy. I could pull another kid across my knees, and the same girl I'd been holding hands with in a roller skating photo sat next to me. It looked like a scene from a field day of some kind, or maybe a graduation. 2 of my mom's friends laughed together in the background, and a red-headed kid sat next to my friends, stared into the distance. I nearly closed the album with that wistful grin still on my face, when I spotted it. Behind the girl's head, poking out just above her hair, was a face. Below it, a child-sized body wore the same green school shirt as the rest of us. But the face itself seemed distended and stretched, almost inhuman, and his eyes were black. I stared at the picture and brought the album close enough to brush my nose, and I looked into those vacant black eyes, and I thought of the picture with my brother. I could almost hear Matt whisper, "Just smile," and I could almost feel his hand digging into my elbow. I closed the album with a pop. Then, rubbing a familiar spot on my chest, I moved towards a trash bag full of discarded memories. but something nibbled at the back of my mind. I can't verbalize the feeling exactly, but I felt somehow like throwing away the photos would be wrong. So I put the small album back into my back pocket, crossed the manicured lawn between the storage room and my parents' new house, and went inside. I should have thrown that thing away. Dan, Uber will be here in 2. My dad's booming voice echoed down the still empty hallway of my parents' new house. I'd been gazing into the photo, and the cold snapped me out of my reverie. How long had I been staring? The photo fluttered to my bed. I tugged on a pair of khakis, then shouldered into a collared shirt, examining my reflection in the room's full-length mirror as I did so, including the bed. The new ceiling-height mirror represented exactly half the furniture in my room. Well, not my room, I thought, but rather the room I'd sleep in when I visited my parents. My reflection stared back at me. The white blonde hair had faded to sandy drab brown, much like my brother's. My skin stretched taut over the sharp cheekbones and dark circles. The calling card of night shift workers the world over. I looked like shit. I leaned closer to the mirror, as if staring for long enough might improve my appearance. Something flashed in my reflection and I jumped backwards with a yelp. For a moment, so fast I couldn't be sure that it actually happened, I'd seen my eyes, my reflection's eyes, flash a deep, empty black. Slowly I looked back to the glass. My eyes were blue, the same blue from my childhood photos. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and shook my head. Hands trembling, I began to fumble with the buttons of my shirt. It took a few tries, but I managed to fasten the lowest one after a few moments. Then higher up, I paused. As I always did, at the scar just above my heart. Once a vivid pink, the race mark had, over the years, turned a faint, pallid white. I ran a finger over the scar, though it had faded. The raised mark still felt, unmistakably, perversely, like a smiley face. 2 dots and a curve underneath. I thought again of the photo laying on my bed. I thought of that stretched inhuman face, and I thought of those deep, dark eyes, like the eyes I'd seen on my reflection just a moment ago. Surely, I mused, the odd face had just been another kid, and the image had been distorted by a trick of the light, or some other issue with 1990s film technology, and surely I had been seeing things in the mirror. My dad's voice interrupted my thoughts. "Uber's here, Dan!" I buttoned my shirt over the scar, and hurried to join my family. "I'm so sorry for the delay, folks," the hostess chirped. "Your table will be ready in 5 minutes, okay?" "Yeah? Well, you said that 10 minutes ago." Matt snapped at her, only half turning the face of the young woman. Her face fell a bit, but to her credit, she maintained a bolted-on service industry smile. "Matt?" my dad admonished half-heartedly. My brother didn't seem to notice. We're sorry again about the delay," the hostess replied, stuttering a bit. She couldn't have been older than 19, maybe. "We'll be right with you." She hurried off into the dimly lit restaurant, and my brother's withering glare followed her into the dining room. I barely registered the interaction. I could think only of the photo. When had it been taken? How old had I been? Which school was it? These questions echoed through my brain, even as the hostess returned to lead us toward her table. "I'm sorry I snapped at you earlier," Matt said as we sat down. The hostess gave a thin, nervous smile, then scurried away. "It was nice of you to apologize." My mom squeezed Matt's arm as the 4 of us settled around at the heavy wood table. I couldn't even muster an eye roll. The pictures bounced around my skull for the rest of the evening. I barely noticed the meal or the festive decorations that adorned the restaurant walls. And, even as a bottle of red wine emboldened my parents, I gave only half-hearted non-answers to their questions of when I planned to finish college and what I was going to do with my life. Throughout the meal, the car ride home, and even as I lay in the empty dark bedroom that night, I could think only of the photo and of those vacant, black eyes. I woke up to a brief moment of blessed peace, but before long, the photo came rushing back to my mind, and I could again only think of those eyes. I rolled out of bed and found the picture on the ground where it had fallen from my hands as I fell asleep. I studied the image. The green school shirt had the years 1999 and 2000 circled around the logo. That would have been 2nd grade. Had I switched to private school yet? I examined the mascot on the shirt, a cat of some kind. Yeah, the public school then. Still holding the photo, I crossed the empty hallway into the kitchen. I had to find the scene where the picture had been taken. I don't know why. Maybe for the same reason I couldn't throw the album away. "Morning, Dad," my mother called vaguely over a newspaper. Mom, can I borrow the Jeep?" "Sure, keys are on the counter." She didn't look up from the paper. "Where you headed?" I was already walking away though, and she asked a question to my back. I didn't respond. I found the old Wagoneer parked at the end of the stone walkway that led from the street to my parents' front door, its wood paneling remaining immaculate, somehow, despite nearly 40 years in the family. I patted the old Woody affectionately and turned the key in the door. The musty scent of the car's shag carpet upholstery brought to mind scenes of high school parties and evenings where I shouldn't have driven home. At the first turn of the ignition, the car mustered only a sputter, but after 2 attempts, its old engine coughed reluctantly to life. I tapped the name of my old school into Google Maps. I spent so little time in my hometown, I needed directions practically everywhere, and my parents' new address didn't help. As I drove through the neighborhood though, the scenes became familiar, if changed a bit by the city's breakneck development, and I followed the directions towards the school. I pulled past the welcome sign, emblazoned with the cat mascot, through a campus emptied by the winter break. The place had changed a little with the years. A row of brick schoolhouse buildings sat vacant, blinds down and darkened, near a wood chip mulch playground. Though I hadn't visited in some time, I still knew the layout well, and it didn't take long to find a parking lot. I pulled the aging wagon into the spot close to the sidewalk, and when I turned the key in the ignition, the old beast went silent with a sputter that almost sounded like a relief. I pulled the picture from my pocket. That face. Those eyes. It took me a moment to take in the details of the photo. It looked like we were sitting on a set of stone steps, or an amphitheater. I walked towards the playground, looking up from the picture to scan the school grounds. The steps had been by a big empty field. I remembered, which must have been near the playground. The school grounds weren't that big. I crossed the mulch, passing a swing set, and spotted the steps up in the distance. There, behind the squat brick school building, a bit overgrown now, sat the grey model stone steps. I thought I spotted a figure sitting on one of the steps in the distance, but I couldn't be sure. I sped up. The small form came more sharply into view as I got closer. I couldn't make out many details, but I could tell now that the figure wore a green shirt. I called out, "Hey!" But the figure didn't move. Closer now, I stopped dead, and my stomach dropped. The scene was unmistakable. 3 grey stone steps, wide and long, framed by the tall trees, bare in the winter, and there, on the first step, where in the photo I'd sat smiling with my friends, was a kid, in a green shirt, with a sandy nondescript brown bowl cut. His head was down though, and I couldn't see his face. I stopped instead, but just as I opened my mouth to speak, to ask the kid who he was and what he was doing there, at the empty school during Christmas break, his head snapped up, so fast that I barely registered the motion. The kid's face was twisted and stretched beyond human proportions. It almost looked like he'd been burned, but his skin didn't have the shiny, raised, keloid quality of scarring. He had all the features of a human face, but each was twisted and wrong in some way. His mouth was small, puckered, and almost circular, but still somehow stretched into a warped closed-mouthed grin. His nose was smashed flat, and his eyes were black. His eyes were not the color black, but black is the best thing I can do to describe the emptiness where his eyes would have been. His eyes were black and I was falling. His eyes were black and that was pushing me to the ground. His eyes were black and my brother's friends were holding me down and their eyes were black. His eyes were black and I was small, and I couldn't fight back, and my brother was grinning when he pressed the white hot twisted metal wire hanger down onto my chest, and his eyes were black and his friends were laughing, and I smelled cooking meat and I screamed, and smoke rose from my chest and wafted up into my mouth and into my eyes were black, and it burned and it burned and it burned, and his eyes were black. I came to in the grass by the steps, climbing slowly to wobbling legs. I rubbed the old scar over my heart and dusted my pants off. The warped, twisted kid was gone. In a daze, I made my way carefully over to the old Wagoneer. The beast rattled to life, on autopilot. I backed out of the small parking lot and drove slowly into the surrounding neighborhood. At least 10 minutes passed before I realized that I had no idea where I was going. So I pulled over, tapped my parents' new address into Google Maps, and still shaking, followed the brief route home. I parked in front of the house and made my way to the stone walkway, still moving automatically. I turned the key in the lock. It was already open. I passed my mom. She said something. I didn't answer. I sat on my bed, not sure for how long. I could only think of those black eyes. At some point, I heard a knock on the door, and I didn't answer, but it creaked open anyway. "You alright then?" Matt asked the question in a tone that indicated that he didn't much care what the answer was. "Just smile, man." I looked up. My brother was grinning, and his eyes were black.